All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first breakout session of today's conference. I think most of the talking will happen over in this half, so if any one of you would like to move over, that would be great. There is, of course, another screen over there as well. So welcome to the session on sustainable coastal ecosystems and opportunities for regional development. It's going to be a session in two halves. So my name is Krista Brunschweiler. I'm an associate professor in economics at UEA. My co-chair of the session is Sheng Qi.
Hi, everybody. So I'm a professor in pharmaceutical science and technology. I'm the associate dean for innovation for the science faculty at UEA as well. So we're both coming from UEA.
And the first part of this session is going to be all about seaweed farming and the opportunities that it gives. So there will be a presentation of a seaweed farming project. And then the second half will be opening up the discussion to wider opportunities and challenges for coastal ecosystem development, where we'll have some new panelists coming on from CFAS, Norfolk County Council, and the Low Carbon Innovation Fund. And then we'd also like to finally open up really the floor to questions from you, the audience. So hopefully you have some pressing questions about opportunities and challenges for coastal development. Let's get started.
Yeah, so just want to introduce our group, the first group, which I think is really a nice exemplar of hitting quite a few of the capitals just been talked about, and also involve a very wide collaboration with local communities and farming communities, industries, as well as universities within the region. So this is a start by our algae innovation platform, and we are actually a spin-out group, going to talk you about what our vision is and what we think it might work in terms of a regional seaweed-based circular economy. So, Ricky?
Fantastic. So hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to this breakout session, and I will really kick everything off with talking about why do we focus on seaweeds, why is a seaweed circular economy needed in the east of England, give some numbers from the world of seaweed, the global seaweed markets, industry, and also take it to the English markets, and then also talk about the algae innovation platform that Sheng talked about. Just a quick introduction to myself. My name is Ricky Nigel-Cleven. I work as an innovation advisor at Heifer Innovation. I also coordinate the algae innovation platform. Really passionate about the ocean, as you probably can see from the picture, and also because I grew up by the fjords in Norway, so loved the ocean and also studied at UEA. Just a quick background as well at Heifer Innovation, just to understand how we got involved with the seaweed sector. We focus on business incubation and innovation, helping businesses to grow and develop and also innovate. And we focus on this by three key focuses: spaces to grow, business insight, and connected communities. We have 2 sites in Norfolk, and we have around 180 businesses at our sites and also our virtual members. We give them business support, and also we give external businesses business support through bespoke advice, workshop, design sprints, mentoring, and so on. But today the really focus is connected communities, so we focus on collaboration between businesses and local researchers, universities, really fostering this cross-sector collaboration and starting innovation platforms around particular challenges or opportunities in the region. So why the focus on seaweed? Well, the growing world population means increased demand for food and land, and we know that by 2050 there will be a 70% increase on the demand of food of people, and we also know that obviously agriculture is constrained by land, by fresh water, and also by the climate to be able to accommodate this demand. However, farming seaweed does not have the same need for the land and the fresh water. So it really is a promising future feed for the growing population, the European growing population, and also have wider applications in nutritional supplements, fertilizers, animal feed, biofuels, textiles, cosmetics, wastewater treatment, bioplastics. Really, the list goes on. Also in the UK, seaweed has been used for centuries as food and feed and also soil enricher. Really important for our island communities and also around the UK coast, the coastal communities. And because of all this interest in applying seaweed in food and other applications, there have really been a growth in the interest in seaweed and the global seaweed market. So because of this has increased the pressure to scale up local production of seaweed, because the demand is increasing, but currently the vast majority of macroalgae cultivation is taking place in Asia, namely China and Indonesia. And if we continue the way we do now and the demand still is increasing, we need to import even more seaweed from Asia than what we do now in the future if we don't scale up local production. And I really believe that collaboration, knowledge exchange and innovation will be key to scale up the UK seaweed industry. Just some numbers from the global seaweed industry there. So the global commercial seaweed market is a $14.1 billion industry. There's around 31.2 million tons produced each year of seaweed produced, 95% of which is produced by farming, and there's around 291 seaweed species commercially farmed. If we look at the UK seaweed industry, we have around 10 commercial seaweed farms, there's around 74 seaweed-related businesses, and around 69% of the seaweed produced is by wild harvest in the UK, which is quite a big contrast to the 95% of seaweed produced by farming on world basis. Thinking about businesses, there's around 33% of business in the UK that has a focus on the food and drink market, 19% on targeting the beauty industry, and 13% producing nutraceuticals or nutritional supplements. But why do we focus on seaweed in East Anglia? Well, Norfolk and Suffolk have over 140 miles of coastline that is bordering the North Sea, which is currently being developed into a thriving energy and raw material generating region, which is also headed by the Netherlands and Belgium by their focus on multi-use sea farms and co-location. Which brings us to the Algae Innovation Platform. So this was really established after talking to local businesses, entrepreneurs, researchers interested in algae and also seaweed, but there was really a lack of a shared platform to communicate about ideas, initiatives, talk about how we can accelerate projects together. So this was really established after thinking about how we can really work together to accelerate the local industry for seaweed. So this platform really aims to collaborate to better understand what is needed to develop a viable and sustainable seaweed industry in the east of England and discuss current barriers for development like licensing application barriers, funding, supply chain logistics, and also processing barriers. And then so far we've had 7 meetings of the platform gathering to talk about seaweed, gather local expertise, domestic expertise, international expertise, to share our experiences and also to network. And so far our meetings have seen the engagement for over 90 people and organizations, which has been fantastic. Again, we really focus on sharing expertise and experiences, having open discussions and also focused talks in every meeting about specific challenges or what's been going on in the industry since we last met up, anything that's relevant to businesses in our region, or really talk about anything that is relevant in the algae industry, seaweed industry at the moment, and focus on how we can work together to accelerate these initiatives. So what is Successful Algae Innovation Platform? What is next steps? What's the vision? Well, we did establish this platform because there was a local interest for seaweed from researchers, from entrepreneurs, so we really want to work to minimize the barriers that are delaying the development that I mentioned, and also continue to raise awareness of the benefits of seaweed. There's still a lot of new phobia around seaweed. It's still something that's really new to people, so hopefully also supporting the local industry, hopefully that will lower some of the barriers that we're seeing and that people really get their eyes open for the many benefits of seaweed. We also want to support the development of a local strategy that encourages algae innovation and of course also the establishment of local seaweed farms, because without supply of local seaweed we won't be able to develop and secure local supply chains to produce seaweed products in the region. And we know that there are already a lot of businesses that use seaweed in their products, that want to use seaweed in their products, but they don't have this local supply. So this would be really important to focus on, and that will also strengthen the circular economy in that area as well. So what we really want is to encourage cross-sector collaboration, commercialization, and scale up spin-off projects from the platform. And then the last thing I will just say is that I really think that the way to scale up the UK seaweed industry, the local industry, is to continue to create communities like the Algae Innovation Platform, to work together to accelerate ideas, to be able to meet the future demand for a growing population, and also to protect our environment. Thank you very much. Over to Jill.
Thank you very much. Okay, so moving swiftly on. My name is Jill Malin. I work in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. Why am I here? Because I've spent most of my academic career working on algae of one type and another. So I'm going to take this a little bit back to basics. If you know lots about algae, you might want to have a small nap at this point. So the term algae covers a huge range of different organisms, from tiny, tiny cells. So here we have an example of one that's 1 micrometer in diameter. You'd need 2,000 to sit side by side on the top of the pinhead, right up to a seaweed called Macrocystis, which gets to 60 meters in length at maturity and grows pretty fast. That's one of the exceptions though. So we tend to classify them by colour. This is a very simple classification scheme. These are organisms that have very different evolutionary histories. They're very poorly related to one another. So it's a bit of a ragbag of different organisms. So we have here the red seaweeds, green and brown. That's the simplest level. I've given you some examples here of things that typically could be farmed in the UK and are farmed in the UK. So porphyra or nori, the wrapping for your sushi, sea lettuce, which you can pick on the shore and eat in a salad, and here Saccharina latissima or sugar kelp, which is one of the organisms that's pretty much a target for most of the UK seaweed farming. And the key thing here is that most of this group carry out photosynthesis. So they take up CO2 and make it into organic carbon that fuels food webs in the sea, and they give out oxygen. And the oxygen that's given out by algae in the whole planet is about half of the total oxygen that's produced. So this is incredibly important for the Earth system today. So very quickly, seaweeds are very different to land plants. This again is sugar kelp here. They have a blade, they have a stipe and a holdfast. The holdfast is simply an attachment to a rock or a man-made structure. The whole thing is photosynthetic. So they, whereas a plant would have leaves and stems, we've got the blade and the stipe. We don't have a root system. And importantly also, they reproduce very differently. They produce sperm and egg and spores that are released into the water column. Okay, how can we produce algal biomass? Well, there's loads of different systems that are used. I'm using a couple of examples here. So here we see in Zanzibar in East Africa, women leading companies that produce algae in relatively warm and shallow waters, hanging them off lines and cultivating and harvesting them on a quite frequent basis. In the centre here, we have an industrial scale Saccharina japonica farm in China, which I visited a few years ago. So this gives you an idea, if you can see it, there's lots of buoys here under which are suspended ropes with seaweeds attached to them. So we're talking about much smaller scale than this, especially at the pilot stage for North Norfolk and Suffolk. In the top one, you see looking from sea to land at this same farm in China, and it's a big industrial site. They were just beginning harvesting and 800 people were working there. You can also grow seaweeds in outdoor tanks where you aerate them to do some really nice mixing. It's often called tumble culture. And at some point in the whole process, you tend to have an indoor phase where you grow the plantlets that get subsequently put out into the field. One of the really nice things that you can do with seaweed farm is to integrate it with other types of aquaculture. So for instance, farming of fish and mussels that you see here are hanging on ropes and invertebrates. And the invertebrates and the seaweeds use the waste products from the other forms of aquaculture. So a nice sort of circular and sustainable, more sustainable system. I probably don't need to tell you that for both us and algae, we're living in times of unprecedented change. We've heard about population rise. There's a nice little graph there on the top left showing how the population has increased in different regions of the world. It's going at a different pace. CO2 in the atmosphere is continuing unabated. So we have a real problem here, and maybe algae can take away some of that CO2. We put all sorts of waste products into the environment. We're getting heat waves, droughts. This summer has been a fantastic example. Wildfires, hurricanes, flooding. These are all becoming much more frequent events. So the algae farming has to be done against this background of the change that we're seeing, and maybe it can help to slow down some of that change that's happening. The United Nations have put forward various goals for these challenges that we face as a human society. Seaweed fits extremely nicely in life below water, but it's also important in terms of production of food, providing jobs, and for the health reasons that people use seaweeds, and we should be doing that more. It has huge potential. I really believe it does. Until we have a pilot plant in the water, we won't really be able to know what that potential is going to look like. But there are challenges too. The licensing, governance and policy process is very long-winded and difficult, somewhat a barrier, and we're behind on the developments in the sector because of that. There's also potential conflicts with other users of marine space, and we really need to get the public on board with what we're trying to do here. There will be jobs. This industry would need manpower. That's very good for coastal communities where fisheries has really dropped off. We'll need to monitor, we'll need to work through extremes of weather that can be damaging to seaweed farms. There will be biodiversity gains and losses, but again, until we have something in the water and we do trials, we won't really know what they are. And I think that's there's a slight risk there, obviously, but I think it is one that is worth taking. We won't know until we try. And once we've got a product or on the way to producing a product, we have to think about the diseases that can occur, the genetic variation and introducing new, potentially alien species into an area. We also need to think about grazing organisms. I have a visiting chair at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. There's an example there where somebody put in a seaweed business and all the seaweed was eaten by turtles, but they were able to set up a tourism business with people going to see the turtles. So you don't know what will happen. We also need to think about food and feed safety compliance, which is also quite a minefield. So where there is great opportunity here, there is also some challenges that we need to think about. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Willie Athill and been working with these guys and we're the ones that are actually trying to grow the seaweed. At the moment we've got an oyster farm up on the North Norfolk coast at Morstan, and we've got our application in with the Marine Management MMO for a 25 hectare sea farm offshore. We think that seaweed aquaculture really could provide some answers to some of the most sort of pressing questions in the debate around climate change, ocean, the health of the ocean, and global nutrition. Do I go right or left?
Right.
Marvelous, thank you. And so we reckon that growing seaweed is going to, growing seaweed and the use of seaweed is going to become a very interesting way of going forward. historically, it's all been done wild harvest. China has been growing an enormous amount, but in England and Europe, it's all been wild harvest. 95% of it has been harvested. And we don't think that's a sustainable model going forward, because what we don't want is what we've done to the land and what we're doing with oil fields and gas fields. We don't want to just take, and offshore fishing, we don't want to take from nature and then suddenly go, oh, where's it gone? So we want to leave the natural biomass and put down farms to see if we can get what we need from seaweed, but growing it. We think it can help hugely on climate. Carbon sequestration, I don't like the word sequestration, but we've got a huge amount of carbon absorption in seaweed. Jill's explained how that works with how seaweed actually grows. It also can reduce this methane production in ruminant cattle, and red seaweed's being used extensively in Australia at the moment to reduce cattle methane production by up to about 70%. We think that we can, using brown seaweeds, which we can grow here, we can reduce by about 30%. That's possible. And there's studies going on in Ireland at the moment, and I think there are some other studies going on in England, I'm not sure where. But Ireland are the forefront in looking at methane reduction. Food, majority of seaweed grown historically has been used for human consumption. It's incredibly good for you. It's actually incredibly nice as well. You can turn, when you boil a piece of sugar kelp, and it's a brown sort of thing that looks like a bit of shoe leather. When you boil it, it turns into the most wonderful, vibrant, green, really emerald green thread that it tastes utterly delicious. So, food, it's full of protein. Jill mentioned that world populations, by 2000, just on Africa alone, which I think is probably about 1.4 billion people, by 2050, the African continent alone is projected to be 2.5 billion. So that's another billion people to feed. We won't be feeding them from land, I don't think. I think we've got to look at the sea. 70% of the global surface is sea. I think there's a huge opportunity to feed people, our global brothers, from the sea. We've got to try and replace the high carbon footprint fertilizers. Fertilizers are all, the feedstock's gas, natural gas. So we've got to try and cut that out. You won't be able to cut it out completely. But what we can do is we can produce biostimulants from seaweed. Goodness, 2 minutes left. That's rather worrying. We've got to try and replace those using seaweed, and that's possible. And Shark will probably talk about that later on. Now, I'm going to quickly skip on because I've only got 2 minutes left. Coastal communities, we've got to work with the other fishermen. Fishermen up there on the coast hate change. Crab fishermen, lobster fishermen, they've been working there for centuries. They hate change. We're coming in and saying, well, this is a good idea. This is not an extractive industry. We've got to work together. There's a conflict there that we've got to work out. So that's one thing we've got to work with. Our objectives is to try and support this government marine plan, and that's laid out there. And that's clean, healthy, safe, productive, and biologically diverse oceans and sea. And by doing that, we're creating, on this 25 hectares, a small pilot to undertake the research of see if we can actually grow this stuff up here. That's where we are. We live here. and that's our sea farm. The oysters are all in here, and the seaweed farm is offshore.
What's the nearest town?
Blakeney. Morstan is the nearest village. That's where we live. How does it work? Go back. How does it work? We go and get spores. We go and get fertile material from wild-grown seaweed from our local seaweed up there. And we send that off to Sam's University, which is the Scottish Aquaculture and Marine Science University, to their hatchery. They take the sporophytes out of that fertile material. You've got your brown bit of seaweed, and it's dark. You get a dark stain sort of along the rib of the seaweed. And in that dark stain is millions of sporophytes. We send this all up. We send the seaweed bit up to Sam's. They put it in there under light, blue light, red light, something light, and the seaweed gives birth, spawns millions of sporophytes that fill the water of that tank. What we do then, we put down a growing matrix into that tank of sporophytes, and this little seaweeds get in to the rope on that growing structure, which has got loads of tiny twine, and they get in there and hang in there with their claws, with their holdfast, and then it grows. Sam says, "When do you want it, Willie?" I say, "I want it in October, because that's when we plant out." And they say, "Right, you can have it on October the 6th, whatever." And by that time, those little seaweeds on that spool are about this long, and they're well entrenched into the twine. They put them on overnight, sends it down to us. Time is up. We go. Sorry, I'm going to run over a little bit. Apologies. That comes down to us. We take it offshore with a boat, and then we attach it to the infrastructure that we've already set offshore out in the deep, which is made up of anchors, chains, buoys, and there's a top line that runs from buoy to buoy, anchored to the bottom, 3 meters deep underneath the level of the water. We anchor one end of our growing top line to that, and then we run it out down the middle of the spool, pull the boat back, and it helically spirals along the top rope to however long you want that. Tie it off at that end and leave it. And 5 months later, and it grows wonderfully in a very high energy environment, cold, it loves the cold, and we leave it for 5 months. And in April, May, we go out there and harvest it. There are many research gaps. There are many gaps that we've got to overcome, starting from the licensing end of things, which we're in at the moment, very unjoined up with the licensee, the licensor, very unjoined up thinking. We've researched the growing of it and the doing of it, the engineering of it, which is difficult, expensive and difficult. But there was a very interesting comment earlier on about scaling up. This lady talked to the guy, Professor Petty, earlier on. Petty, was it? Pretty, I'm so sorry. And about scaling up. We can only scale up when we prove that we can do in the first place. Otherwise, it's just going to be too expensive. So we've got to get this, see if we can do it, yeah, and everything tells us we can. There's fantastic water out there, full of the goodies we need for seaweed. The light levels are good. The temperature is good at the moment. The temperature is excellent. We can do it. Licensing is difficult, but we're getting there. We should be having a license by the end of this month. We've just got to get that first farm out there, together with academia, science the scientists and business people who want to buy the stuff, and which we've now got this little group that we're working on, this little platform that's been put together by Ricky and Nigel, and we've got that little group together now. We'll get it done. Thank you.
Thanks, Willie.
Sorry.
So I'm going to talk a bit about the hope that Jules mentioned in his earlier talk about how we can scale up and what the hope behind that might be. And the particular interest I had in coming to the issue of possibly large-scale seaweed farms in East Anglia was to look at the carbon initially that could be fixed by that. So there's principally 3 ways I identified, and Jules confirmed this, thankfully, in her presentation, that we can grow seaweed. I would call coastal seaweed farming what Willie's just been describing. So it's fairly close to the shore. What I'm going to be discussing in a moment is offshore work, which is much further afield. And the other option is to grow it on the dockside or seaside in tanks of some nature or other. But when we get to the sort of scale that offshore seaweed growing is possible, then potentially we're into quite an interesting carbon economy as well. Just to recap, I won't linger on this, but as Jill said, seaweed, most seaweed, at least the seaweed we're interested in, is photosynthetic in nature, which is how we get the carbon into the biomass in the first place. And a good thing to note is that it will assist the oceans, the seas, in drawing down carbon which they're already overburdened with. So that's the starting point. What I wanted to do was to look at how we might supplement the natural sequestration of standing kelp farms or fields, for instance, forests, which you find out in other parts of the world, which are mentioned at the bottom there, with what we can do at the top with farming it at scale, and then having captured the carbon, sequester it in various products, some of which have already been mentioned. So let's get to the scale issue, and this is where things start to get interesting. We have a burgeoning offshore wind industry in this part of the world. The southern North Sea is one of the focal points for the UK's offshore wind strategy. And between now and 2030, a huge amount of extra offshore wind infrastructure is planned to be developed. And I just took a snapshot and calculated for all the new wind farms, that's not including the existing ones, and the closest one was just to the top right of Willie's map, where his farm is going to be. So we could actually start there on an existing wind farm. But some of the new ones, it's mind-boggling the area that they're going to occupy of the seabed. And if you just take a power density of 3 megawatts per square kilometre, which is pretty moderate, I would say, for the size of the wind turbines that could be 10 to 15, even higher, 20 megawatts each in future, we're probably looking at an area of the order of Suffolk that will be occupied by new wind farms, supposedly between now and 2030, if everything comes to plan, which it's unlikely to do, but if it does, that would be the case. So let's take that area and imagine for a moment that we farm 10% of that, or even 20% of that land area. What that boiled down to in the simple modelling that I did was a comparison between the carbon that would be fixed by the seaweed, and on the top right there, I took 10% of that's 380 square kilometres, let's say, of seaweed, of Saccharina latissima, the sugar kelp that Jill mentioned, and the technology that Willie just mentioned. How on earth do you actually create the infrastructure for such a farm? This is a massive challenge, and it is yet to be solved in nearly every way. But we are working on it. Our European partners are developing the the harvesting gear. There's a big question around which kind of line or mat or net is the best substrate upon which to farm the seaweed, given the fact that they don't have the holdfast opportunity, especially in our sort of muddy, sandy shores and sandy seabeds. So I took a line-based model, and that was spaced at 1.5 meters, which is completely theoretical. I have to underscore this at this point, because if you have a line a kilometre long, let's say, and it's got another line running at 1.5 meters away from it, that's going to get tangled. There's no doubt about it. But we have to start somewhere with the estimations, and with that in mind, taking those other parameters into account to derive the carbon that could be harvested and the carbon dioxide, we end up with a chart something like this. So, and what I thought would be very interesting was to look at what's the cumulative CO2 collection potential compared to forests. We hear a lot about money going into reforestation, and that's a great idea, but it has some serious risks associated with it, with climate change, not least fire. Seaweed, fireproof, great idea. Let's try and now compare that to the carbon and sequestration, the fixing and sequestration issue. Well, the trees have a great advantage in that they can sequester right on the site. We have to work that one out with seaweed. But that chart gives some idea of how seaweed performs, in this case, sugar kelp, compared to the tons of CO2 from oak and other tree species. And what this chart is interesting. I delved into to get the data for this analysis. I looked at the Forestry Commission's data on how different types of forest growing in different kinds of ways capture carbon and sequester it. And what was interesting, which I hadn't realised before, because I'm an engineer, I'm not a horticulturist or a forester or a biologist, is that trees have a kind of life cycle which is similar to humans. They peak out in early midlife, around 30, 40 years, in their propensity to capture carbon and sequester it, and then it slowly declines over the next up to 100 more years of life. Whereas every year we can farm seaweed, which is represented by the green bars here, and have a constant measurable output, which I thought was particularly interesting. What does that boil down to? Well, if you take the area of East Anglia as defined by this little map here, and what I did was I used the Tyndall Centre, University of Manchester scatter tool, which has deftly calculated the carbon budgets for different local authority areas in the country. If you sum them all together, you get a chart that looks like that blue line, and that's if we're going to comply with our Paris Agreement, how we have to drop carbon emissions from our budget of between 100 and 125 megatons of CO2 between now and 2100, and how we might use large-scale seaweed carbon fixation, not to mention the sequestration problem requiring solving, to offset some of that compared to forests. So that gives us an idea that between 10 and 20% of the planned new offshore wind farms, we could meet what would happen from trees. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Scott de Beer. I am the Managing Director of Biotechnica. We are, as far as I could determine, the oldest seaweed processing company in the UK, going back quite a long time, all the way to, let's say, Major Chase that ploughed seaweeds into the Channel Islands, barren lands, to get agricultural going. So it's actually quite interesting to discover, when you go back, seaweed was part of life. 100 years ago in Ireland, it was quite fairly well known that seaweeds were used in agriculture, and Major Chase was the first one that actually looked at it properly, and then decided to stimulate more agricultural development using seaweeds. One of his first clients was somebody that, I can't remember the name now, but was actually the founder of the Soil Association, one of the founders of the Soil Association in the UK. So the extraction business started on the agricultural side by virtue of the fact that it was so difficult to apply it in. It was labor intensive, it was smelly, and then that gave birth to the extraction industry, is to actually take the seaweeds, extract it into liquid form, and rather get the liquid forms into the lands. Now, this is where we are today. It's interesting to me to look at the history of the extraction business as such. During the 70s, 80s, the chemical fertilizer companies became quite powerful, and then sort of ended up supplying the farmers with agronomists for free of charge. The agronomist went to farms, worked out the requirements for fertilizer in the grounds, and then made a recommendation to the farmers, to use their range of products. And unfortunately, as life goes by, the soils were really seriously eroded, because effectively what we did is we fed wheat, corn, whatever plants we had, we fed them with steroids. So the actual organic carbon content in soils in the UK has gone from, let's say, 30% in the 1700s to about less than 10% today. So our mission in life is to get it back. We harvest from the wild. Most of the seaweed we process is Ascophyllum nodosum from Ireland. Let's say mostly east coast of Ireland and west coast of Scotland. The main focus for us is the biostimulants. So in the case of Ascophyllum, you have this massive, let's say, change between low tide and high tide. And the plant itself has developed a lot of functional biological molecules that actually act as, let's say, protection against sun, cold, etc. So in essence, the biostimulants, the components that we get from the plant, act as the active ingredients that would help plants to help them, veer off and have protection against abiotic stresses. So that could be saline conditions, it could be droughts, it could be cold, it could be heat, etc. So it's a very, very natural, 100% organic product that we produce, and it actually, in terms of studies, prove that it helps the plants to be more effective in terms of photosynthesis and more effective absorbers of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, etc. Obviously, in terms of the life cycle analysis, it's quite difficult to prove, how the sequestration part works. Ultimately, if you increase the organic carbon content of soils, that is sequestration, and that's basically the idea behind it. So this is the way it's done in Ireland. You have a dying generation of people that know how to harvest in a sustainable way. They're only allowed to harvest, let's say, 10% of the biomass per annum, because that's what they see grows back. But I mean, the industry as such is almost dying, because these sort of these people are not there anymore. The young generation is not prepared to work the seaweed as such. So you have to look at mechanical harvesting. Mechanical harvesting damages the ocean floor. So it's really not sustainable. The only way to do this is to basically look at a holistic picture of cultivation, and then cultivation also needs support. Because if we scale up cultivation, we have to manage the mass of seaweed that is harvested. So we can't just take a small little portion of seaweed and say, okay, that's functional, what do we do with the rest? So to give you an idea, the wild harvest is about £1.30 per kilogram dried that we pay. If you look at the small scale cultivation farms, they need to fetch £5 per kilogram dried harvest, and that's not sustainable to, let's say for us, we're not yet able to pay £5. The only way that £5 is going to come down is if the seaweed scale goes up, and then the economies of scale go into it. And as for us, the more sophisticated we get in terms of creating bioproducts and various nutraceutical components, pharmaceutical components, food, we can pay more. So the higher the value, the more we can pay. But I think it's very important to understand the mass balance. You have to balance it. So for each 4 tons of seaweed processed, only 1 ton is used. The rest is basically so-called fibrous waste. And that fibrous waste has incredible potential in terms of, let's say, packaging material, biodegradable packaging material, organic fertilizers, and the like. But it still has to be developed as such. So from a biorefinery point of view, these are all the steps that one can do. The industry already is quite big. If you look at from alginates to nutraceuticals to cosmetics. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of adding the components and making sure that we can catalyze, let's say, innovation and product development from, let's say, the highest value to the lowest value when it comes to scale. And that's effectively what we are all about. We are constantly looking at the concept of a biorefinery. We have certain portions of the biorefinery already in place. We're working with very exciting companies in terms of the development of organic fertilizers, either through compounding with other natural NPKs or fermentation for that matter. We're working with an exciting company that does biodegradable packaging. They did the little sachet for the London Marathon in which they encapsulated water. So it takes a sort of I think, integrated approach to make the whole thing work. Because if you only focus on one component, you would not be able to match your balance between every ton of harvest has to have a place where it's going to go from a commercial point of view. That's it. Thank you.
So thank you all for this first part, a very exciting possibility. Next, we're going to move over to our second part and then bring everything together. So we're going to have short presentations now by Tiziana Luisetti from CFAS, Katie Owen from the Norfolk County Council, and then Saffron Maihel from the Low Carbon Innovation Fund. They will tell us very briefly about their work, and then we'll go over to the actual panel discussion part. So Tiziana, do you want to come up first?
This slide is just more for my memory, really, because it's really bad, just to what I wanted to tell you. So my name is Tiziana Luisetti. I'm Principal Environmental Economist at CFAS, where I lead the socioeconomic strategy there. And I'm also honorary senior lecturer at UEA in the School of Environmental Sciences. And I just want to point out that our link between CFAS and UEA is because of the Collaborative Center of the Sustainable Use of the Seas, CSAS, and so we try to collaborate together. So some of the colleagues here at UEA are part of also of this collaborative center. So my research, my personal research, is mostly on coastal and marine ecosystem services and natural capital. So I look basically at everything that is in the sea. So all the different ecosystems and the ecosystem services that are provided. But what I look most deeply in is blue carbon. So we heard a lot about carbon today. So I looked at salt marshes, seagrasses, mangroves, but also for the talks that we heard today, most relevant is the shelf sea sediments, because there, for example, in the talk Nigel gave, they did detritus that we have from the plants, then sink in the shelf sea, and there the sequestration and the storage actually happens, and so we can have a mitigation action of the ecosystem with blue carbon. So what I do is the economic valuation of blue carbon and also the accounting that we do both within the standardized system that is called SIA and also within the natural capital accounting that can have a little bit more freedom, and in the UK is presented by the ONS, and we supported them with the first marine natural capital account. But I also look with my team at CFAS at marine biodiversity, seafood. We've looked at marine litter impact, blue economy, cultural ecosystem services like, for example, ecotourism, invasive species, and coastal protection, both in the UK and the Commonwealth countries. So this is just to say that I'm getting lots of food for thought here in this conference today. And yeah, so I look forward also to the discussion on the seaweed farming and circular economy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for having me here with you this afternoon. I was going to say now it's time for something slightly different, but I'll set myself up saying that I am a former marine microbotanist. I'll not look you in the eye when I say that. Having worked on phytoplankton as part of my PhD for UEA, and I'm also a graduate of CFAS as well, having worked in the phytoplankton lab. So I do have really strong connections to marine algae, and I was really excited to hear some of the presentations we've seen today. But that's not what I'm going to talk about now. What do I do now? I am the Protected Landscapes Manager for Norfolk County Council, and I was thrilled to be invited because I think it's really important that you have local government representation, particularly when we're hearing about, you know, really interesting topics. And I think that all of this links back to what we heard this morning from our really great speaker, Mr. Pretty, who talked to us about net gain, who talked to us about considering the environment alongside local rural economies and alongside the people who live there too. So this is really where I come in. And I think collaborative coast, I wish I'd thought of that earlier, it really sums up a lot of the work that I do, and I may borrow it. So sorry if you see that recycled in advance. So what am I talking about? Willie sort of stole my thunder a little bit with some Norfolk mapping, but these are essentially the three parts of the county that I am responsible for. So we'll start up on the Great Wash embayment. Spent a lot of time out there floating around with Eastern IFCA. But that is actually a really highly designated area. If I call it the former European Marine Site, I won't have to say the B word, and I think you all understand what I'm talking about, but very designated and really exciting in terms of not only the ecosystems it contains, but the cultures which are intermixed with that ecosystem. So lots of artisanal, small-scale operations going on in there, combined with some of the larger industry. We also have the Norfolk Coast AONB. I don't know where my dot's gone, but it's over there somewhere.
Doesn't show on the screen.
Doesn't show on the screen. All right, well, there you go. The Norfolk Coast AONB, bottom left, craftily divided up into three big chunks just to make it extra confusing for you all. AONB is Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, in case anybody wasn't aware. And my remit with working with the Norfolk Coast Partnership, which looks after the AONB, is not only to conserve and enhance natural beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, slightly subjective, so whatever that may mean, but also to enhance and secure the future of the communities which are located within it. So that means making sure that we have vibrant rural economies and local communities to make sure that the AONB thrives into the future. I mean, I always say that people need AONBs and AONBs need people. So I think this link between protection and prosperity, which we're circling around today, is absolutely vital and central to the work that I do. If I wasn't busy enough, you may recognise me from my other job, which is looking after Norfolk and National Trails. These are our promoted series of walking, cycling and horse riding routes across the county of Norfolk. We're incredibly blessed that we have two national trails. We have the Norfolk Coast Path, nearly did the pointy again, but you can see that running down the coast. And we also have the Peddars Way, which joins it coming inland from Nettishall Heath just outside of Thetford. So the reason I have responsibility for all of these is because I think if you're really going to go forwards and think about protection and prosperity, you also need to consider the way that people access our special landscapes and the way that people travel around within them. Much of what we've talked about today is related to a low carbon society. So encouraging use of walking and cycling and horse riding routes is particularly key, I think, to protecting both of these locations. I often come back to this: bigger, better, more joined up. I think it says very simply what I'm trying to do with my new team here at Norfolk County Council. For the first time ever, It's a triumph of local politics, but for the first time ever, we have each of these partnerships all under one boss, which is me. And why are we doing that? And I kind of sometimes I think I'm struggle to convince people, but I think I'm preaching to the converted here. Each of these boxes here, I think, is absolutely central to delivering a sustainable future for our landscapes and the people who live in them. But I don't think a single one of these boxes can be delivered in isolation. So for me, collaboration between each of the 4 partnerships listed is central to delivering anything related to net zero, anything related to 30 by 30. Nature recovery is impossible without including communities and economies and really building that modal shift in with it. Farming in protected landscapes and shifting towards new environmental land management schemes. We need to really bring access and people and nature and culture together there to have lasting change. And I think I will leave it there because I've run out of time. But that's me in a nutshell.
Then Saffron.
Hello everybody, I haven't got any slides, so nothing to look at other than me, unfortunately. My name's Saffron Myhill and I lead up a small team at the University of East Anglia. For the last 12 years or so, we've been running a fairly major programme called the Low Carbon Innovation Fund. And that's a big part of the work that our team do. We also do some other things, which is generally all about supporting businesses with new technologies and new products that will help us to decarbonise. So most of my work is it's either writing funding bids at the moment, or it's reviewing business plans and looking at technologies, looking at new products being developed, assessing how useful they're going to be in terms of decarbonisation. So we do a whole piece of work on benchmarking that new technology, new product, and see what the real world impact will be from that. Looking at the business plan to see whether it's a feasible business and whether we would want to make really a commercial style investment, co-investing alongside private sector investors. So we have, we're a venture capital fund, but we're slightly different in that we have these other goals, which means our main targets are to reach a certain level of carbon reduction impact. We also want to bring new products to market. We want to create new jobs. We want to develop new businesses within the east of England that will spawn new jobs and help all of these researchers and really clever academics who've come up with new technologies to stay in the region. We want to create new jobs around this coastal area and the whole of the East Anglia, and have exciting new businesses here rather than them going off and draining away. So that's me. We have a small team. We do 3 main projects, which is all about decarbonisation, helping businesses to raise the money and to find the right people that they need, to count the carbon, the real world carbon impact, and to make investments into those businesses. Because if we make good investments, those companies will grow, they will have the impacts that they intend to have, and we will eventually have the money back from good investments to make more. So that's me. Thank you.
And while I move this lectern out of the way, so I'm going to mix things up a bit. I'm going to start out with a question to Tiziana and the same question then to Saffron, and then I'll end up with our representative from the policymaker side. So Katie, you're going to be last for the moment. So all the same question. Thinking of your work, what do you think are the 2 main challenges and opportunities for sustainable coastal development in our region? Maximum 2, can be less.
Okay. It has been really inspiring to listen to Joe's Pretty this morning, and also very informative, all of the talks here. So putting all of these things together, I think that the biggest opportunity obviously comes from the environment, from the landscape and the seascape of the region. And it was inspiring listening to just this morning talking about creativity and innovation. So one thing that I think might be an opportunity for the region is considering, for example, creating a sort of tourism around the food, the seafood production in the region. So related to what you have been talking to about seaweed, then I think something that could be related to the traditions, but also that it's looking far into the future, because we know that we are going to face big challenges for food security. So I think that could be an avenue creating innovation and creativity. And so the challenges that I see related to these are, and Jules mentioned those, are two main ones. One that Katie also mentioned, and I think it is the infrastructure of the transport infrastructure, that, you know, if you want to be a tourist and a visitor in the region, it's really difficult even to reach the paths that you showed. And I was looking at your map like, okay, there are trains getting there closely, or I can bring my bike and then cycle there, because from Norwich everything is quite far. And the other challenge, I think, still related to this, is about capacity building. So creating, educating and training for the new generations to maybe thinking about these culinary tourism and be part of it and create innovation on that. And I think there is a lack of probably giving hope, saying, well, there could be new jobs. You know, this is how you do it, looking at the tradition, looking at the future, training them, and then let them free to create something new.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, lots of talk.
Saffron.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point, and I think one of the key things here for me, I was born and grew up in North Norfolk. I live very close to Morstan now. I think one of the key things you touched on was the sort of dispersedness of us all, and that cuts across lots of different topics. So in terms of transportation and connectedness of the communities of all different kinds. So we've got the geographic communities, we've got the business communities who are all quite separate. We've also got the academic community and the business community, which I see, I mean, my job is to step between those. But there are very few actors joining those different communities together, I feel. That they seem to be working quite separately. So I think that more joined upness, more forums for different industries to come together, and academia to come together with industry, so that we can get these ideas out into the world being used in a practical way. I think that's it's both a challenge and an opportunity, and I think it's both a strength and a weakness, in that actually I think in some ways we're very lucky in Norfolk, because it is a small place. We all get to know there's definitely a feeling of we're all in this same region together, and we do bump into each other across different topics. So I think that more joined upness is the real opportunity here, and more will happen as a result of that.
So finally to you, Katie, you are joining up sort of
Doing my best.
academia and policy making.
I think, I agree with both of the points really well made by the two previous panellists. I think what I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about is communication and language, and the power that has to include and to exclude. So you'll see one of my boxes was equity of access. And that's something I think should just be the bare minimum that we all consider. So I think when we're trying to work with communities, I think it's this and it's not a bit critical of the scientific world at all. I see it across the board. There's a lot of focus on this parent-child type of communication, and I think when we're trying to engage the world around us, we can't change. This room will not change a thing unless we take hearts and minds with us. And to do that, I think you really need to think about how we communicate with the people we need to help us to do this, whether it's business communities, whether it's ethnically diverse communities, where it's people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Everybody has a role to play in what we're talking about. So ensuring that everybody feels welcome in the conversation and is able to contribute to it in some part, I think is absolutely vital to achieve the kinds of things we're talking about in the areas that we're working with.
Okay, thank you very much. Food for thought. I'm making notes, but first,
So I'm gonna keep it short. I'm gonna skip the first part of my question and move on to the second part because we are limited with time. Just to use the seaweed technology, platform we just been heard as example. I just wondering, we heard Willie talking about there are challenges still, the licensing opportunities, and there's many gaps. Just wondering from investors, from local government bodies, what do you think the kind of support you could offer to support this kind of different type of community come together to work towards not a particular type of product, but is a whole kind of supply chain and the whole local economy? So what the government and investors could really offer for this type of network and platform?
Really good question.
Well, let's start with Katie this time.
Yeah, as a sole government representative, I'd like to say that anyway, let's not go down that road. I think that do you know what I was really interested in when I was listening to Willie talk, and I just thought, why are we sending this to Scotland? Think about the carbon miles involved in there, and I think about number one conversations I have with people is about a lack of year-round jobs, a lack of jobs in interesting careers, skilled careers, well-paid careers, careers that lead somewhere in the area I work in the rural Norfolk coast. So, I mean, that was the first thing I thought is if we have a seaweed hatchery in Norfolk, let's get Scotland sending their seaweed to us. Let's get a hub for the. I think the establishment of this algae platform is fantastic. But let's work with the bids. Let's work with the growth hubs and the LEPs. And try to why can't we have something in Lowestoft, in Great Yarmouth, in Jaywick, in Wivenhoe? We've got these fantastic places that are dead easy to have an inline piped-in supply of seawater. Let's do that and let's start growing our own talent. And I think that kind of grassroots, bottom-up sort of approach is vital. That's a small step change, but I think that is how you bring academia, you bring careers in science and careers in carbon neutrality to areas that may think of themselves as not traditionally involved in it. These are all former fishing towns, but essentially what we're doing is revitalising an industry very closely associated with that way of life, but with a modern spin on it. We're future-proofing, marine farming for the 21st century. So absolutely, let's work with the resources that we have available to begin to do that in our area.
Great. No, I think that's very useful. I think it's very useful when we have this joint presentation. We identify the gaps, and I was thinking exactly the same thing. Saffron, what do you think?
Yeah.
Because you were talking about the investment, for at least for your organization, is for product driven. For this one, is not a single product driven, but it could turn into multiple.
And I've no idea. I've learned everything I know about seaweed today, this morning. And I've no idea how much it costs to put up a hatchery and to man that and to get that up and running. But that does feed into developing a new cluster, which government policy is all about. Having clusters of different industries that can then help to generate themselves. You get a critical mass going, and that has wider impacts. I think from my point of view of where we would usually come into a business, We're equity investors. We look for a business that has viability, has commercial viability, and there are several stages that have to be got through to de-risk first of all the technology, but also the business itself. And usually that falls to Innovate UK, or it falls to other bodies to provide sort of de-risking funding to get it to such a stage where private investors can start to get involved, and funds like ours can start to get involved. So I think that early stage of moving out, transitioning from academic research, transitioning from a brilliant idea that looks great on paper, but we need to prove certain things. We need to, go back to sort of lean methods of proving that the concept can work, and that there is enough of a market out there that are going to take your first year's harvest, and you're going to be able to grow from that point. That there is a whole series of steps that need to happen before then. So, I mean, the grant funding environment has changed massively. We all know that. ERDF is no longer there. The other European funding pots are no longer there, and like it was said this morning, we've got small local pots being offered to local authorities. So what we need to do is to shoal those various local authorities that could benefit from this to get bigger projects going, because I think if it goes into individual local authorities, it's not going to stimulate bigger projects that really need to happen that will benefit a wider area.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Final thoughts from Tiziana?
Well, if I can add anything to what has been said, it's probably, and was probably touched this morning as well in one of the questions, maybe what I see is a lack of coordination and maybe of leadership to put all of these things together for these activities to be coordinated and be related from nature to the consumer that it's going to use it, and for the communities to thrive and look into the future.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much. I think, are we time up?
Yes,
I
unfortunately.
think we slightly overrun. So thank you very much for everybody attending. We're gonna be here. The seaweed group gonna be here. If anybody has any questions, let's just talk about over a lunch break. So thank you for attending the session.
Thank you.